It's the big final round clash at the FIDE Candidates 2024. Hikaru Nakamura with the white pieces takes on Gukesh. Hikaru is half a point behind Gukesh and opens the game with 1d4. Gukesh has this luxury of the sole lead. How will he respond? He goes d5. And Hikaru now, will he play the London? Not really. Queen's Gambit, c4 on the board. Will Gukesh play a Queen's Gambit declined with e6? No, he goes for the accepted variation. He takes on c4. Now, why this game is so critical is because if Hikaru wins, he ensures himself at least a tiebreak. It depends a lot on the game of Fabi and Nepo, who are also on the same score as Hikaru, who are playing against each other. But if Gukesh manages to win, he wins the tournament. A draw would also make them wait for the game of Fabi and Nepo. Knight f6 played here. And now Hikaru plays the move e3. So he wants to take the pawn on c4 and Gukesh plays his pawn to e6. The typical way in playing the Queen's Gambit accepted is that you will strike in the center. But Gukesh goes bishop e7. This is not the most popular move there because generally you want to play c5. If he takes, you want to take it directly without having moved the bishop. But here, this is played. Knight comes out to c3, which is a fine move. And now Gukesh plays c5. So essentially what Gukesh is saying is that I was waiting for your knight to come to c3 before hitting with c5. And Hikaru plays a3. Maybe a more logical way was to castle and then play e4 and white would have been fighting for an edge. But after a3 castles, and you can see Gukesh actually having 1 hour 53 minutes on the clock, Hikaru having 1 hour 45 minutes, he also castles it out. Now for black, there are many ways to continue. But I think the most logical way is to play a6 and b5, and that's exactly what Gukesh does. He plays a6. His idea is to play b5, bishop b7, get his knight out to d7 or c6, and black is doing fine. So queen comes out to e2. And in a way, the queen is making way for the rook to come to d1. Gukesh pushes the pawn to b5, hitting the bishop. The bishop has to move away. And it can drop back to d3 or it can go back to a2. It goes back to a2. And now Gukesh can simply play his bishop to b7. Okay, there can be d takes c5, bishop c5 and b4. That's the reason why Gukesh takes. But this is a very dangerous move because after e takes, it opens up the bishop and the rooks will flow into the center. With d5 move looming large, so Gukesh has to be careful. What does he have on his mind? b4. In conjunction with taking this pawn on d4, b4 is an excellent move because if you take here, knight c6 and I'm putting pressure here. So fantastic chess by Gukesh. Knight e4 played by Hikaru. And I think this was a very, very important move, b4, that Gukesh played here. Let's see how he continues the game. He takes on a3, which is the best move in the position. In such positions, you have to be careful about your rook here, which is undefended and hanging, but there are no tactics happening for the time being. B takes a3 played, and now will Gukesh put his bishop on this beautiful long diagonal. Looks very sensible. Look at the focus of Gukesh. He's completely zoned in. He plays his bishop to b7. He knows today is the big game. This game, if he manages to do well, will get him a world championship match, which is not a small thing for a 17-year-old boy. Hikaru keeps the pieces on the board. He plays his knight to c3. And Hikaru has to win. A draw would mean that he would be half a point behind Gukesh. And Gukesh now brings his knight to d5 and he tells Hikaru that if you want to trade, let's do it. I guess knight e4 is possible, but then Gukesh would be ready to repeat. So bishop goes to d2. And now Gukesh cannot really play knight d7 because that would mean that take here and then his structure might be spoiled. So that's the reason why he first takes on c3, forcing Hikaru to take back with the bishop. And then he can actually maneuver his knight from d7 to f6 and then again settle down on the d5 square. The opening has gone well for Gukesh. You can look at him there, completely focused, even though if it is not his move, because Hikaru is simply going to come and take on c3. And now, how does Gukesh continue? Well, knight c6 is perhaps not the kind of move you want to make because of d5, pawn takes pawn, and rook a d1. This is just exactly what Hikaru wants. So that's the reason why knight d7 is a fantastic move. Bishop comes to b1. And Hikaru essentially is trying to create some play on the king side, maybe creating a battery like this. Gukesh gets his rook into the game. He plays rook c8 and attacks the bishop here. The bishop comes back to d2. And now Gukesh brings his knight to f6. I like how he's calmly, slowly and steadily improving his position, bringing his pieces into the game. Even in this all-important final round clash, he is finding some great moves here. Bishop d3 played by Hikaru, who's putting pressure on the a6 pawn. And you can see there Gukesh being slightly stunned. He takes on f3. He takes this knight. Queen takes f3. And now this means that he can go and snatch the pawn on d4. He has 58 minutes on the clock. Hikaru has 42 minutes. And Gukesh instantly takes on d4 and tells Hikaru that, hey, you cannot really win this pawn because your bishop on d2 is hanging. So in a way, Gukesh has won a pawn here. Well, Hikaru gets his rook here to d1 and now wants to threaten the a6 pawn. But he has given up a free pawn. Like, there are ways to save this pawn. For example, you could play a5. It's not such a silly move. But Gukesh finds the best move. He not only gets the queen out of the way of the rook, but also defends the pawn. Hikaru now goes in queen b7 and it's a double attack. He's attacking the bishop and he's attacking the pawn. So how does Gukesh now continue? Well, Gukesh goes for the move bishop c5. Very interesting move, because if you take queen takes a6, queen h4 is a killer blow. And instead, if you play bishop a6, rook b8 almost wins the game. Like, this is completely winning. So that's the reason why Hikaru plays bishop e1. But now Gukesh saves the pawn and he tells Hikaru that I'm a pawn up. And in this must-win scenario, Hikaru's chances of winning the game are almost non-existent. Queen b5 played, offering the trade of queens. Will Gukesh snatch the queen and exchange it? Or what will he do here is the question. Well, he takes on b5. And bishop b5, very likely. Yes, bishop b5 played. Now, this pawn, if it is lost, then white would have excellent chances. But you see how Gukesh calmly brings his bishop back and tells Hikaru that in order to win that pawn, it will be some hard work for you. Hikaru brings his rook to c1. And now Gukesh brings his knight to the center of the board, very nicely blocking the d file, looking at the c3, b4 squares. And after king f1, wants to calmly. Hikaru may want to get his king into the game, but rook d8 played. And now king f8, king e7. You see how Gukesh is nicely improving his position. a4. a4 is the pawn push, fixing this weakness. King f8 played. Also, it's important for Gukesh to keep an eye on the game of Fabi and Nepo, because if in case their game is ending in a draw, a draw is an excellent result for Gukesh because he wins the tournament. But if Fabi or Nepo, either of them are winning, maybe Gukesh has to try a bit more or then get ready for the tie breaks. Hikaru brings his king into the center of the board. It's sometimes quite sad for Hikaru, who's looking for, the full point to play this pawn down endgame, because I think the best he can hope here is a draw. But you can see him fighting there. You can see how he's making his moves. He's trying to sort of tell Gukesh that even in this scenario, things can get somehow difficult for you. We are on move 31. Gukesh has 25 minutes on the clock. Hikaru has 25 minutes on the clock. Gukesh after this move has 18 minutes on the clock. Rook takes, rook played. Bishop takes. And maybe now this knight sits in on the b4 square. That should be the plan here. Yes, he plays his knight to b4. And now if you were to take here, I would take it back with the bishop so that my e6 pawn is defended. But Hikaru goes rook b1. He's keeping the pieces on the board and he's trying to take and attack the b4 knight. Gukesh calmly brings his bishop and plays bishop c5. Rook c1 played, and you can see that a new threat has been created on the c5 bishop. So for example, if you are careless and if you play g5, bishop takes e6 followed by rook takes c5 could be dangerous. So first the knight comes back to c6, and interesting because if you take here, now there is check and I win with the knight and I defend my bishop. So that's the reason why Hikaru goes bishop c3. g5 is played on the board, just trying to create some kind of a clamp down on the king side with g4. Hikaru plays his bishop to b5, and maybe the most natural way to continue is check. King bishop takes, and we have the opposite colored bishop position. But Gukesh goes bishop a3. His point is, of course, that the rook is hanging, and after rook c2 played. Now, very careful because the a5 pawn is hanging and also the knight is hanging, and very importantly, if you had gone here, then I would have played bishop b4. So that's the reason why rook c2 played, check, bishop takes, rook takes, and now Hikaru finally enters in with his rook, and he tells Gukesh that I'm finally getting back my pawn on the h7 square. But Gukesh seems unperturbed. He's unfazed. He puts his king on f6, and after rook takes h7, so the material is even, but now this rook on d4 and the bishop can combine to put pressure on the f2 pawn, which is what he goes bishop b4, trying to enter the position with rook d2 check. Gukesh gets up and then goes back to the most important game there, trying to see what's going on there. Bishop d3 played. Hikaru maybe is in the best possible situation throughout the game that he has had. Material is even, but the position is so simplified that there is hardly any chance here. He plays e5, which is interesting because after this check, king g7, f5 pawn is hanging, but this is hanging. So let's say if I move my rook away, there's already e4 with a great position for black. So Hikaru plays f3, and Gukesh is very direct. He just pushes the pawn forward. He is playing this really well. He attacks the bishop. The bishop, after pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. The bishop on d3 has to move away. But where exactly does it go? Hikaru plays his bishop to b5, which is a logical move, putting the bishop on a decent square. And Gukesh now goes bishop e7. Well, I guess it was possible to give this check, but after king e3, this pawn is not really hanging because the rook defends it. So that's the reason why he goes bishop e7, and you can see how Gukesh is busy watching the game of Fabi and Yan. Well, it's interesting because Gukesh has a lot of time on the clock. Also, the position is kind of equal. G takes h4. And now G takes h4 taken. White has an outside passed pawn. Black has a central passed pawn. And now rook to b4 played. You can see how Gukesh is very confident in this scenario. Like, there's not even a moment where you see that he's hesitating, where the enormity of the situation has got the better of him. Not really. It also shows that he's a big match player here. Now Gukesh plays his king to g7, opening up his bishop towards the h4 pawn, and his idea is to push the pawn on e3 and then capture it with his rook there. Well, Hikaru plays bishop d7, brings the bishop back, puts the bishop back on d7, slightly confused there, and finally plays it. Let's see what Gukesh's response is going to be, because Hikaru has attacked the a5 pawn. He goes rook d4. A very interesting move. His point is, if you take on a5, I'm going to take on d7. So the bishop goes to e8, still keeping the a4 pawn defended. And now Gukesh plays bishop d8. Nice move, defending the a5 pawn. I like how Gukesh is keeping everything together. And after rook f5, now we could take here on h4, but then there is rook takes a5. Well, Gukesh takes it. He takes the pawn on h4 and he tells Hikaru that you can go and snatch the pawn on a5. It doesn't really matter because we now both have one pawn each. What a exciting battle here by Gukesh. The game per se has been very solidly played by Gukesh, but also now that the result is coming closer, will it give him the title is the question. Rook a8 played. Well, Hikaru wants to push, and then maybe get his rook out and make it into a queen. So Gukesh has to play this slightly carefully. He goes bishop g5, maybe with the idea of check, and then pushing the pawn forward, because then the bishop is controlling all these important squares along with the pawn. And now he goes bishop h5. Interesting. He's getting the bishop back into the game. And now what does Gukesh do? He gives a check. It's a good move because it forces the king onto the last rank. So he goes king f1. And maybe now Gukesh can put his rook behind the passed pawn. That's exactly what he has done. He's put his rook on a2. Well, the pawn pushes forward. a5 is on the board. And now Gukesh plays check. Maybe he'll give a few checks here. Like king e2 is met with check again. So he goes king g2. And now check, king goes back to f1. So Gukesh is kind of happy with the draw here, of course. But Hikaru checks his score sheet and says, maybe I have to keep trying because that's my only chance. I have to hope against hope, because a draw would mean that his chances of candidates are done. But a win is what he needs. And Gukesh is not allowing him to escape these checks. How is he going to escape it? Because if king e1, there is a check and you lose this pawn. So he goes king d1. And now Gukesh goes in with a check to the king with his rook. If king c1, I just simply move back. a check and you lose the rook. And that's the reason why king e1 played. Rook comes to d5. And threatening bishop d2 check and winning this pawn. So king e2 played. And Gukesh can actually repeat now with check. I think he should do it. But Gukesh finds a very straightforward way to hold the game. It's a double attack. With this, he attacks this pawn on a5 and also the bishop on h5. Hikaru pushes his pawn to a6. Gukesh quickly comes back. He has 14 minutes left on the clock. Hikaru has 24 minutes. Fabi and Nepo's game is getting crazy. Fabi is winning actually. So Hikaru, now Gukesh takes the bishop on h5 with his rook. Very interesting, because if you were to play a7, then rook a5 back is the move. Oh, he's going to go a7 it seems. Yes, he plays it. a7 is on the board. Gukesh goes back. Now, if you take here, king takes d2, then after king g7, the position is drawn. So he goes check. Gukesh brings his king into the center of the board. And Hikaru now makes a queen. He makes a queen on the board. And Jan Nepomniachtchi comes back behind Gukesh to now realize that this game is an absolute draw, because now pawn comes to e3. Exactly, a rook versus bishop in itself is a draw. So here you even have an extra pawn as black as far as ahead on the third rank. So after rook a4, cutting the king off here, you will see that Gukesh just moves his king. And it's important not to touch the bishop, because now if the white king starts to get active along with the rook, then black just has e2, e1 in two moves. He's going to queen, so there's nothing much left here. King c5 played by Gukesh, and Hikaru, being the pragmatic player that he is, goes to rook e4 and now just takes the pawn. You can see Pragnananda in the background. Bishop takes, and it's the historic moment. The game ends in a draw and Gukesh keeps his sole lead intact. Later in the day, the game between Jan and Fabiano ended in a draw, which meant that this became the most crucial game of Gukesh's career. With this victory, he's made it to the World Championship match against Ding Liren, which is a huge result for Indian chess. Gukesh becomes the second ever player after Vishy Anand, second ever Indian to play the World Championship match now later in November. But also Gukesh is the youngest ever to win the candidates at the age of 17, surpassing the achievement of Garry Kasparov at the age of 20. And who knows, if he wins the World Championship match in November, he will become the youngest world champion. I love how Gukesh is rearranging all the pieces of both himself and his opponent. All the pieces have now been set up, and now he pays respect to the board. There you have it, and he'll be on his way. Congratulations, Gukesh, for this amazing result at the Candidates 2024.